The house was not old, not in the way ghost stories usually begin. It was stubbornly new, a sterile box of drywall and particle board, erected just 4 years prior in the aggressively mediocre subdivision of Whispering Pines. Yet, something was wrong with 148 Hawthorne Lane. Elias Vance, a gaunt, perpetually exhausted freelance architect, had bought it for a steal. The previous owners, the Harrisons, had practically fled, citing a vague, pervasive unrest. Elias, a man whose skepticism was his only reliable defense mechanism against the world, assumed it was a drainage issue or a noisy neighbor. He was wrong. It began on the third night. A sound. Not a creak or a groan, which the house, despite its youth, seemed to indulge in, but a hollow thud. It came from the interior of the walls, a flat, muted smack as if someone had just placed an open palm against the wood studs and retreated. Elias was in the kitchen, nursing a lukewarm beer and sketching a floor plan for a client who wanted an eco-friendly dungeon. He froze. The sound was distinct, singular, and utterly out of place. He chalked it up to the house settling, a term he'd always found ironically sinister. The next day, it happened again, this time while he was unpacking boxes in the master bedroom. Thud. This time, it was followed by a faint, almost inaudible scratching, like sandpaper on dry wood. He pressed his ear to the nearest wall. Nothing. Just the familiar, dead silence of new construction. Over the next week, the sounds escalated, both in frequency and complexity. It wasn't just thuds and scratches anymore. It became a rhythm, a fragmented, disjointed language. Tap, thump-thump, pause, scrap. It was a percussion track to his life, impossible to ignore. He started mapping it, meticulously noting the time and the location in his journal. He realized the sounds were confined to one specific area, the long, unbroken wall that stretched from the entryway, past the coat closet, and into the living room. Then came the first truly chilling development. Elias was talking on the phone with his sister, casually complaining about the poltergeist of cheap lumber. As he leaned against the kitchen counter, the wall adjacent to him emitted a sudden, sharp rat-a-tat-tat. It sounded like a frantic, desperate knock. "Hello? Elias?" "What was that noise?" his sister asked, her voice crackling. Elias didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the wall. He reached out a hesitant hand, expecting the usual hard, inert surface. But as his fingers brushed the drywall, he felt it. A momentary, undeniable warmth that radiated from a spot roughly at chest height. And beneath the gypsum board, something shifted. A fleeting pressure, like a soft, yielding mass had just been pressed outward, then instantly released. He snatched his hand back, heart hammering against his ribs. "Elias, you are freaking me out. What is going on?" I have to go," he whispered, hanging up the phone before she could object. He grabbed a flashlight and a heavy-duty box cutter. He needed to see inside. He knew, with a certainty that defied all reason and architectural training, that the settling was over. Something was in the walls, and it was no longer just making noise. It was reacting. He stood before the long, silent wall, the box cutter trembling in his hand. He chose a spot near the center, right where the warmth had been. He pushed the blade in, the drywall giving way with a crumbling sigh. He sawed a rough, 3-inch square hole. He shined the beam of the flashlight into the dark cavity. The light revealed the pristine wood studs, the pink fiberglass insulation, the snaking electrical conduits, all as they should be. Except for one thing. Near the floor plate, tucked behind a mess of wires, there was a small, crudely cut piece of velvet ribbon. It was dark crimson, faded, and looked decades old. He reached in and pulled it out. As soon as the ribbon was in his hand, the house fell into a silence so profound it felt like a pressure headache. The thuds, the scratches, the knocks, all gone. Elias was about to dismiss it as a random piece of construction debris when he turned the flashlight back to the hole. The light beam caught something within the dark insulation, just beyond the far stud. It was small, white, and seemed to be wedged tightly. He squinted, maneuvering the flashlight. And then he saw it. It was a piece of paper, folded multiple times. And surrounding it, meticulously arranged like tiny offerings, were dozens of small, dried teeth. They weren't animal teeth. They were human, juvenile teeth, like those lost during childhood, but unnaturally preserved and polished. Before Elias could process the horrifying display, the folded paper in the insulation began to vibrate. Not shake, but hum with a low, deep frequency. And from the now silent wall, right where the hole was, a whisper slithered out, thin and cold as razor wire. "You found the first. Now you must finish the game." The whisper didn't echo. It was immediate, dry, and terrifyingly close, as if the wall itself had a throat. Elias stumbled back, the box cutter clattering on the hardwood floor, the crimson velvet ribbon slipping from his grasp. The silence that followed was worse than the cacophony of thirds. It was an active, malevolent quiet. He forced himself to breathe, his mind desperately seeking a rational explanation, a ventilation trick, an elaborate prank, residual sound from construction workers. But the whisper had been clear, personal, and unnervingly specific. "You found the first. Now you must finish the game." And then there were the teeth. Elias cautiously approached the hole again. The intense vibration had stopped. He shone the light. The dozens of tiny, white teeth, molars and incisors, were still there, nestled in the pink fiberglass, but the folded piece of paper had shifted, sliding slightly toward the opening, as if inviting him. Swallowing the bile rising in his throat, he grabbed a pair of tongs from the kitchen drawer, avoiding direct contact. He carefully plucked the paper out. It was heavy, fibrous, and smelled faintly of cinnamon and dust. Unfolding it revealed not a message, but a crude, hand-drawn map. It was a floor plan of his own house, 148 Hawthorne Lane, complete with the basic layout of the ground floor. But scrolled in thick, black ink were 6 distinct X marks. 1 X was already circled. It marked the exact location where he'd just cut the hole, the wall between the kitchen and the entryway. Beneath the map, written in the same bold, childlike script, was a single, disturbing sentence: "The 7 echoes need their friends." Elias leaned against the wall, clutching the paper, his architectural training kicking in despite the adrenaline rush. 6 X's left, and a mention of 7 echoes. What was the 7th? The ribbon he'd found? The paper itself. He realized the game wasn't about surviving the sounds, it was about finding something. The teeth, the ribbon, the paper, they felt like pieces of a fragmented whole. The very unrest the Harrisons had complained about wasn't a haunting, it was a desperate, internal signaling. He scanned the map, focusing on the remaining 5 X's on the ground floor. Under the stairs, marked with a small doodle that resembled a child's coffin. The den fireplace, marked with a simple drawing of a spiral. The pantry floor, marked with the number 3. The powder room ceiling, marked with a stylized eye. The living room window frame, marked with a tiny, unsettling stick figure. Elias decided to start with the easiest, and perhaps the most exposed, the pantry floor. He moved to the small pantry off the kitchen, his heart beating a frantic tattoo against his ribs. The floor was covered in standard, 4-stone vinyl tiling. He got down on his knees and tapped the tiles. Most were solid. But in the corner marked 3 on the map, a tile sounded distinctively hollow. He used the tip of the box cutter to pry it up. It came loose with a dry, suction cup pop. Beneath the tile, the concrete slab was broken. Not cracked by age, but deliberately smashed open, leaving a neat, square-shaped void leading down into the dark earth. He shone his flashlight into the hole. The beam illuminated the cold, damp soil and, resting exactly in the center, was the next friend. It was a small, child's rocking horse, made of polished cherry wood, but it was pristine, almost new. The chilling detail, however, was that its rocker feet were gone, neatly sawed off. As Elias reached for the horse, a thick, sweet odor wafted up from the hole, the smell of rotting flowers and something metallic. He pulled the horse out, placing it carefully on the counter beside the map. As soon as the object was removed from the earth, the small rocking horse began to gently oscillate on its flat, sawn-off base, rocking back and forth for 3 full cycles, before becoming eerily still. And from the now open cavity in the floor, Elias heard the second echo. It wasn't a tap or a scratch this time. It was a single, crystalline sound of a child's giggle, abruptly cut short, like a broken music box. Giggle. Silence. He stared at the map on the counter, the 7 cryptic echoes, the 6 X's, and the 2 terrifying objects he had unearthed. This was not a standard haunting. This felt like a deliberate, desperate message, hidden within the structure of a brand new house. What were the echoes? And what happened to the child who owned the horse and lost their teeth? He picked up the rocking horse and the velvet ribbon. He knew he was supposed to put them together, but he didn't know how. He only knew he had to find the remaining pieces before the echoes started to communicate something other than fear. He looked at the next X on the map, under the stairs. The one marked with a small, childlike coffin. The game had just begun, and Elias was certain he was playing for the life of someone he hadn't met. Elias stared at the crude map and the 2 artifacts, the crimson velvet ribbon and the small, flat-footed rocking horse. The horse still smelled of metallic sweetness and damp earth. The silence in the house felt heavy, as if the air itself was listening to his pulse. The next destination was the void under the stairs, marked chillingly on the map with a simple sketch of a child's coffin. The space under the stairs at 148 Hawthorne Lane was typical, a small storage closet, deep and dusty, filled with mismatched paint cans and a forgotten vacuum cleaner. Elias pulled everything out. He ran his hands along the bare, painted drywall on the deepest wall of the closet. The surface was cold, solid, and unremarkable. He pressed the map against the wall, trying to align the doodle with the structure. The coffin sketch wasn't drawn in the middle of the wall, but low, near the baseboard, slightly to the left. He tapped the area with his knuckles. Thud. 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 All solid. Elias crouched low and used his flashlight, meticulously scanning the juncture where the wall met the floor. That's when he noticed it. The baseboard molding, which was a single continuous piece everywhere else, had a minute, almost invisible vertical seam at the X location. He took the box cutter again and gently worked the blade into the seam. With a faint creak, a section of the baseboard, no wider than a cigar box, hinged outward, revealing a black, empty void. This wasn't just construction debris, this was a deliberate, concealed compartment. Elias shone his light in. The space was shallow, smelling intensely of old, burned-out matches. Resting on the dirty floor of the compartment was the third friend. It was a small, heart-shaped locket made of tarnished iron. It was cold to the touch, and strangely heavy. It was latched shut, and there was no loop for a chain. Elias tried to pry it open, but the mechanism seemed fused. He used the flashlight to examine the surface. Instead of any decorative engraving, the front of the locket was crudely etched with a single, unnerving image, a tiny, stick figure hand pressing against an invisible pane of glass. As Elias pulled the locket out, placing it next to the velvet ribbon and the horse, the third echo struck. It came not from the small compartment he'd just exposed, but from directly above him, emanating from the risers of the staircase itself. It was the clear, piercing sound of a small child, not crying, but issuing a muffled, desperate plea for "Mommy." The sound was wet, choked, and ended with a horrifying snap, the sound of a door being slammed shut and locked. The snap echoed in the closet, leaving Elias trembling, the raw terror of a small child's final moments hanging in the air. This wasn't a playful sound like the giggle. This was a moment of true, soul-shattering panic. Elias backed out of the closet, wiping a sheen of cold sweat from his forehead. He looked at the three items now arranged on his dining table. The velvet ribbon, found near the teeth in the wall. Echo 1, Whisper of the Game, the sword-rocking horse, found buried under the pantry. Echo 2, Cut of Giggle, the iron locket, found in the hidden baseboard compartment. Echo 3, Muffled Plea. He had a chilling realization about the objects. The pieces were not placed in the house, they were sealed within the house. The teeth, the horse, and the locket were all relics of a child who had been systematically dismantled and hidden as the house was built. He picked up the iron locket again. He gave it a hard twist, and with a terrible, grinding shriek of metal, it popped open. The inside was not empty. Clipped tightly within the locket was a small, faded photograph. It was a picture of the back of a young girl's head. Her hair was pulled into a high, messy ponytail tied with a crimson velvet ribbon. Elias stared from the photo to the ribbon on the table. They were identical. He flipped the locket over. The back of the photograph was blank. but on the inside of the iron locket's casing, someone had scratched two initials, A.B. The seventh echo, that. The map mentioned was not an object or a sound. Elias suddenly understood the phrase, "The 7 echoes need their friends." The 7 echoes were the friends. The 7 fragments of a single, horrific memory. He had 3 fragments. 4 more X's remained on the map, each one marking a stage in the child's final suffering. He looked at the next X, the den fireplace, marked with a strange, dark spiral. He could no longer deny it. He wasn't just in a haunted house. He was in a tomb disguised as a suburban home, and he was being forced to perform the unholy resurrection of a forgotten victim named A.B. Elias felt a desperate sense of urgency now. The fragments he found were not random relics. They were components of a crime scene, sealed during the construction of the house. A.B. The initials resonated with a terrifying finality. He had to finish this grim excavation. The next target was the den fireplace, marked on the map with a strange, dark spiral. The den was a small, unused room off the living area. The fireplace was gas, with a standard black grate and a shallow, 4-stone hearth. Elias turned the gas off at the main line outside the house, just in case. He knelt before the hearth. The spiral on the map was drawn right on the stone lip of the fireplace opening. He examined the 4-stone, a thick, non-porous composite. Everything felt solid. He ran his fingers along the grout lines. When he reached the spot corresponding to the X, he felt a subtle, jagged irregularity. It was tiny, like a splinter of glass embedded in the mortar. Using a kitchen knife, he picked at the spot. The mortar crumbled away easily, revealing a small, cylindrical plug of wax. It was thick, black, and smelled faintly of burnt sugar and sulfur. Elias scraped the wax plug out, creating a small, keyhole-sized opening. He peered into the gap. It led, not into the flue, but horizontally into the wall adjacent to the fireplace. He shone his flashlight into the dark. The beam illuminated a shallow cavity, similar to the one under the stairs. Resting inside was the 4th friend. It was a thick, leather-bound journal, small enough to fit in a child's palm. The leather was sticky, and the pages were stained dark around the edges. But the most unsettling detail was the cover. It had been deeply gouged, over and over, into a chaotic, mesmerizing spiral, the exact pattern on the map. It looked like the frantic work of a small fingernail or a shard of glass. As Elias reached for the journal, he heard a new, terrifying sound from within the cavity. The 4th echo. It was a deep, guttural choking sound, accompanied by a frantic, wet scraping, as if a hand were desperately trying to climb out of mud. It didn't sound like a child, but a much older, deeper voice, a sound of panicked, suffocating regret. The sound ended in a loud, wet gasp, followed by a thick, heavy splat. The echo was different this time. It wasn't the victim's voice, but something darker. The killer's final moment. Elias quickly pulled the journal out. The moment it left the wall, the choking sound cut off completely. He opened the journal. The pages were mostly blank or filled with childish doodles, smiling suns, lopsided houses. But the last 3 pages contained writing, clearly done by an adult hand, written in a cramped, hurried script, "She knows. She saw the horse. I said it was gone. She asked about the ribbon. I told her I burned it. The hiding spots are good. I made the house myself. A solid cage. I am safe in the walls. I just need to silence the echoes." All 7 of them. The writing stopped abruptly, the last word trailing off into a long, dark smudge. Elias' blood ran cold. I made the house myself. The writer wasn't the child, A.B. The writer was the one who had built the house, the one who sealed A.B. inside, and who was now trapped alongside her. This wasn't a historical haunting. This was a contemporary trap. And the writer, the killer, knew about the 7 echoes. He placed the sticky, spiral-etched journal next to the locket, the ribbon, and the horse. 4 pieces recovered. The friends of A.B. He looked at the remaining excess on the map. The powder room ceiling, marked with an eye, and the living room window frame, marked with a stick figure. Elias was no longer just an unwilling excavator. He was an investigator uncovering a murder committed by the very structure he lived in. And the killer was still here, its presence manifesting as the terrifying 4th echo, a sound of final, suffocating, guilty panic. He had to move quickly. He was releasing not just fragments of the victim, but also fragments of the killer's death. Elias felt the weight of the journal's confession pressing down on him. I made the house myself. A solid cage. The builder, the killer, had died attempting to permanently silence the child, A.B., and the house had become a mausoleum for them both. He quickly secured the 4 items, ribbon, horse, locket, and journal, in a heavy toolbox, needing them contained before he continued. The next point on the map was chilling, the powder room ceiling, marked with a large, stylized eye. The powder room was small and claustrophobic. Elias dragged the stepladder in and looked up. The ceiling was smooth, popcorn texture, painted a dull off-white. There were no vents or light fixtures near the X location on the map. He tapped the ceiling with his knuckles. It was solid everywhere, except for one circular spot directly above the toilet. It sounded thin, papery, and distressingly resonant. He climbed higher and scraped away the popcorn texture with his knife. Beneath the paint, the drywall was not just thin, it had been cut and patched, poorly, leaving a faint, almost invisible seam in the shape of a large circle. Elias cut around the seam with the box cutter. The circular piece of drywall fell away, revealing the dark void of the floor joists above. He shone his light up. The space was tight, filled with dust and insulated pipes. But in the center of the opening, suspended by a thin piece of rusted wire from a crossbeam, was the 5th friend. It was a small, ornate pocket watch, antique brass, but utterly blackened and scorched. The glass face was cracked into a spiderweb, and the hands were frozen at a specific, chilling time, 3:07. Elias pulled the scorched watch down. It was hot, despite the cold air of the house. As he held it, he felt a faint, rhythmic ticking start beneath the blackened brass. As soon as the watch was removed, the 5th echo began. It didn't come from the ceiling void, but from the toilet tank and the sink pipes in the small room, amplified by the porcelain. It was the sound of a low, monotonous humming, like a lullaby Sagovki. The hum was overlaid with a relentless, repetitive splashing, as if someone were repeatedly submerging a heavy object in a bathtub. The sounds were relentless, maddening, conveying not pain, but a terrifying, forced calm. Elias gripped the watch, his own heart hammering a chaotic counter-rhythm to the low humming. He looked at the cracked face and the frozen time. 3:07. Was that the time of ABS death? Or the builder's? He quickly climbed down, stepping out of the small room, and the second he crossed the threshold, the humming and splashing cut off instantly. The echoes were strictly confined to the space where the friend was found. He examined the watch under the stronger dining room light. The back of the brass casing had been scratched repeatedly with a sharp point, creating the stylized, watchful eye seen on the map. This was the killer's sign, the sign of being watched, of surveillance. He knew what he had to do. He found a sturdy pair of pliers and forced the back of the watch open. Inside, beneath the mechanism, was a tiny, rolled-up slip of paper, brittle and yellowed. He unrolled it carefully. It wasn't writing, but a small, detailed drawing by a child. It was a portrait of a man, drawn with clumsy affection. He had thick, dark hair and was smiling. Beneath the drawing, in ABS tiny, legible handwriting, was a caption, "Daddy's Big Surprise House." Elias felt a wave of nausea. The builder, the killer, the writer of the frantic confession in the journal, was ABS' father. The house wasn't just a tomb, it was a perversion of a gift, a betrayal sealed in drywall. He looked at the map. Only one X remained on the main floor, the living room window frame, marked with a terrified stick figure. Elias had 4 echoes left to hear, 2 more friends to find, and a horrifying truth about a father's madness to fully uncover. The game was reaching its climax. Elias' hands were shaking as he placed the scorched pocket watch, the chilling symbol of the father's surveillance, into the toolbox. The full, sickening narrative was now terribly clear. A father built a house as a big surprise, but the surprise was a systematic, agonizing imprisonment and murder of his own daughter. A.B. Only one X remained on the ground floor map, the living room window frame, marked with a terrified stick figure running towards the frame. The living room was bright, overlooking the street, the only part of the house that felt connected to the outside world. The window was a large, modern bay structure, framed in vinyl. Elias focused on the lower sill, where the stick figure was marked. He ran his hand along the cold vinyl. It was a seamless piece, but when he pressed hard on the corner, he felt a subtle give, a slight wobble. He used a screwdriver to pry off the decorative cap on the innermost corner of the sill. Beneath it, the vinyl frame was filled with a hardened, grey material, not insulation foam, but plaster. He started chipping away at the plaster with the screwdriver. It was tough, clearly intended to be permanent. After several minutes of strenuous work, he exposed a dark, small gap in the internal structure of the frame. He shone his light into the narrow crevice. Inside, wedged deep between the thermal panes and the structural wood, was the 6th friend. It was a small, white porcelain doll's head. The eyes were closed, painted with delicate lashes, but a thin, almost invisible seam of black glue ran across the mouth, sealing the painted lips shut. The back of the head was flat, as if it had been sawed off to fit the tight space. This was a relic of ABS' desperate attempt to escape, a final, silenced plea for help directed toward the outside world. Elias used the tongs to carefully extract the doll's head. It was cold, unnervingly smooth, and perfectly matched the terrified stick figure on the map. As the doll's head was removed from the window frame, the sixth echo erupted. It was the most violent and physical sound yet. It was the loud, repeated smash of glass, accompanied by rapid, frantic screaming, the genuine, high-pitched shriek of a child in mortal terror. The sound seemed to concentrate directly on the window frame he was working on, feeling like a memory playing in the very structure of the glass. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop, and a cold gust of air, smelling sharply of bleach and fear, swept over him. The screaming and glass breaking lasted for a horrific 15 seconds before abruptly ending with a final, sickening, heavy thud from the window frame itself. Elias leaned back, gasping, wiping the unexpected cold sweat from his neck. The house, this perfect cage, had played him the sound of ABS' ultimate, brutal attempt to break free. He placed the doll's head on the table with the other artifacts: the ribbon, the horse, the locket, the journal, and the watch. 6 friends. 6 X's on the map. 6 fragments of ABS life and death. Elias picked up the map. The ground floor was complete. But the note still bothered him: the 7 echoes need their friends. He flipped the map over. The back was blank, but as he stared, he realized the pencil lead from the front had pressed a faint outline through the paper. He held it up to the light, and there it was, the hidden map of the second floor. Drawn on the faint outline was only one single X, marked in the center of the master bedroom closet. It was marked with a final, cryptic symbol, a simple, closed circle. Elias looked up the stairs. He knew the final echo, the final friend, had to be in that closet. The father had hidden the first 6 fragments in the walls of the house, but the final, 7th piece, the culmination of the game, was waiting in the most personal and intimate space of the home. The cage was finished, and Elias was about to step into the final trap. Elias gathered the 6 artifacts, placing the velvet ribbon over the doll's sealed mouth, a silent gesture of sympathy for the quieted screams. He knew he was one step away from solving the physical mystery, but the psychic toll was immense. He had unearthed a monster and his victim. He ascended the stairs, the hardwood groaning under his weight. The second floor felt colder, the air thinner, as if all the house's oxygen was being consumed by the hidden history. The master bedroom closet was a walk-in, spacious and empty, save for a few boxes Elias hadn't yet unpacked. The X on the hidden map was marked squarely in the center of the largest wall. The cryptic symbol, a simple closed circle, felt like a final, absolute seal. Elias cleared the wall and pressed his ear to the drywall. Absolute silence. No thuds, no scrapes, no movement. This was the core, the final resting place, and it was guarded by an unnerving stillness. He tapped the wall. Solid. 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 But right at the center of the X, the sound was subtly different. Not hollow, but dead. A flat, heavy thunk, as if tapping on something thick and dense, not drywall and air. He took the box cutter and, abandoning all precision, cut a large, jagged hole right at the center of the X. The drywall resisted, breaking off in stiff, chalky pieces. He shone his light in. The cavity was not the usual chaotic jumble of studs and wires. Instead, the entire internal space was lined with a neat, custom-built box of rough-sawn cedar, a small, clean, airtight coffin built into the wall structure. But the coffin wasn't empty. Lying inside, on a bed of dry, crumbling sateen, was the seventh and final friend. It was a tiny, pristine white shoe, a child's Mary Jane. It was clean and utterly dry, looking like it had just been slipped off a foot. The small, silver buckle was unlatched. This final relic wasn't hidden to punish the house's inhabitants, it was hidden to mourn. This was AB's final possession. As Elias reached for the shoe, he noticed something else. Taped to the inside of the cedar box, visible beneath the toe of the shoe, was a single, folded piece of thick, dark material. Elias carefully removed the white shoe. It felt fragile and light. The moment it was out of the wall, the final, seventh echo began. It wasn't a scream, a choke, or a whisper. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated joy. A sustained, delighted laughter, a sound so real, so vibrant, that it felt like AB herself was standing right behind him, happy and free. The laughter built, echoing throughout the master bedroom, rising in pitch until it reached a dizzying, manic crescendo. Then, with a painful, drawn-out squeal of tearing metal, the sound cut out. The silence that followed was the heaviest yet, a vacuum that seemed to suck all light and hope from the room. Elias felt the familiar wave of nausea, realizing the father had trapped the memory of her greatest happiness, ending it with the sound of his own terrible final act. He turned his attention to the thick, folded material taped inside the cedar box. He carefully pulled it off. It was a section of heavy-duty black industrial tarp, the kind used to cover materials during construction. He unfolded the tarp. It wasn't a friend, but the final, terrifying piece of the father's confession. Written on the tarp in massive, sloppy strokes of what looked like dried black paint and blood, was a message that filled the entire surface. I sealed the joy so she could never take it out. The house is perfect, but the walls are thin. You found all 7 parts of her. Now you will take the one part of me. The key. Elias looked around the closet, heart pounding. The 7 friends were now found. The echoes were complete. The father's final message promised a key to what? The true nature of the cage. He looked back into the cedar box. With the shoe gone, he could now see the very bottom. The box was not backed by drywall. It was backed by a small, steel safe door, no larger than a shoebox, set flush into the studs. The closed circle on the map hadn't marked the artifact. It had marked the safe. And set into the handle of the small safe, perfectly sized to fit, was the final, ghastly element, a single, adult fingerbone, fused with dried concrete, acting as the fixed handle. Elias realized the true horror. The father hadn't just built a cage for AB. He had built a perpetual, living prison for himself. And Elias now held the tools to open the final lock. Elias stared at the crude, horrific lock, a steel safe door, small and menacing, set deep into the cedar box, its handle a piece of adult fingerbone. The father, the builder, had literally entombed himself piece by piece within his perfect cage. He reached out, his hand recoiling slightly from the fused concrete and bone handle. He twisted it, and the old steel lock within the small safe mechanism gave a loud, metallic clunk. The safe door swung open easily, revealing a dark, tight space, the very heart of the father's self-made prison. Inside was not gold or jewels, but two final, devastating items: a stack of official-looking blueprints for 148 Hawthorne Lane, rolled tightly and tied with industrial twine. A large, smooth, polished stone, a river rock, slightly warm to the touch. Elias pulled out the stone first. It was heavy, and as he gripped it, he felt a strange, momentary comfort, quickly replaced by a profound, chilling grief. As he handled the stone, the house did not echo. Instead, the air around him became perceptibly colder, and the faint, sweet scent of rotting flowers and metal, the smell from the pantry floor, returned, this time overwhelming the closet. He unrolled the blueprints. They were detailed architectural drawings, stamped with the name of the builder and owner, Arthur B. Vance. A.B. Vance. Arthur was the father. A.B. was his daughter, whose initials he shared. He quickly scanned the plans. They weren't standard construction documents. Arthur Vance had scrolled annotations and additions in red ink over the professional drawings. Most of the notes were psychotic ramblings about perfect angels and silencing the vibrations, but one section was meticulously labeled, the seventh echo chamber. It was located exactly where Elias was standing, the master bedroom closet. The blueprint showed a detailed cross-section of the cedar box, the safe, and the wall structure behind it. The diagram indicated a large void space behind the safe, leading down into the floor joists of the closet. Arthur's final, cramped note on the blueprint read, "I kept the last part safe. She will never have it back. She will never be whole. When the game is finished, the walls will open. The stone is the last truth." Elias looked at the smooth river stone in his hand. The last truth. The walls will open. He realized the game wasn't just about finding the 7 friends, it was about completing the circuit. By gathering the 7 fragments of A.B., the friends, and now retrieving the 2 final pieces of the father, the blueprints and the stone, he had unintentionally activated the house's final, intended purpose. He looked back at the safe opening, which was backed by the master bedroom wall, facing the hallway. He set the stone down and pushed at the back of the small safe cavity. The entire cedar box, safe door and all, suddenly retracted with a heavy, grinding sound into the wall, revealing the large void space Arthur had labeled. The hole was wide and deep, leading down between the studs. Elias shone his flashlight down into the darkness. And there, resting at the bottom of the long, dark drop, was the final, terrifying sight. The cavity was not empty. It was filled with a thick, syrupy black liquid, oil or something organic, that coated the bottom. And in the center of this viscous fluid, was the source of the lingering sweetness, the metallic odor, and the profound silence. It was a small, perfectly preserved skeleton of a child. The bones were clean, unnaturally white against the black fluid. The father had dissolved and sealed his daughter's body within the deepest, most inaccessible part of the master closet wall. As Elias looked down at the remains of AB, the true, final echo did not come as a sound, but as an overwhelming, collective sensation that washed over him, a sudden, crushing weight of absolute, perfect despair. It was the full, complete emotional memory of AB's loneliness, fear, and final, suffocated hope. Elias stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The light beam hit the wall, pointing down into the black hole. And then, the walls of the master closet began to move. The drywall around the hole started to ripple, the paper tearing silently, the seams buckling. The perfect cage was dissolving. From the newly opened structure, a cold, dry, invisible force rushed out, swirling around Elias. It wasn't the father or the daughter, but the energy of their sealed tragedy, finally unleashed. He was no longer safe. He had played the game and opened the cage. The collective weight of AB's despair hit Elias like a physical shockwave, stealing his breath and clarity. The air in the master bedroom closet turned icy, then abruptly hot, carrying the metallic scent of old blood and the lingering perfume of the rotting flowers. The walls, the perfect cage, built by Arthur Vance, were aggressively buckling. The drywall didn't just crack, it began to warp and soften, the gypsum board looking less like a solid material and more like damp, stretched skin. Elias scrambled back from the hole, revealing AB's remains, frantically trying to grab the flashlight. He recovered it and aimed the beam at the swirling, cold force that had burst from the wall. He saw nothing, yet the presence was so potent it felt like a visible fog. Suddenly, the warping stopped. The house settled into a heavy, unnatural silence, but the master bedroom was now fundamentally wrong. The walls were no longer flat, they were convex, pushing inward slightly, giving the closet the appearance of a pressurized chamber. Elias looked at the river stone, the last truth, lying on the floor beside the blueprints. He picked it up. As his hand closed around the smooth, warm rock, a final, internal vision flashed behind his eyes. He saw a manicured lawn, a shovel, and the father, Arthur Vance, sweating and panting, digging a shallow hole at 3:07 a.m., the time frozen on the pocket watch. He was burying something small, then pouring concrete over the disturbed ground, all while his other hand clutched a river stone, the very one Elias held now. The father's frantic last act of guilt and sealing. The stone was the physical anchor of the entire structure, the final piece Arthur had used to bury his guilt beneath the pantry, believing he had permanently silenced the evidence. Elias looked at the hole leading to AB's remains. He saw the 6 artifacts on the floor, the ribbon, the horse, the locket, the journal, the watch, and the doll's head. The 7 echoes. AB was finally whole. He heard a low, scraping sound from the wall opposite the cedar box, the wall facing the bedroom. The concave drywall there began to bulge, stretching like a balloon. And then, a large section of the wall ruptured. It didn't shatter, it tore open like wet cardboard, revealing the dark, spider-webbed space between the studs. But this cavity was different. It wasn't the fiberglass insulation. The entire space was filled with a dense, black moss or fungus, pulsing with a faint, oily luminescence. And out of the pulsating blackness, a hand emerged. It was an adult hand, skeletal and long, the skin stretched and dried like leather. It was missing the ring finger, the one Elias had used as the safe handle. The hand scrabbled for perches on the torn drywall, its movements stiff and desperate. It was Arthur Vance, the father, finally unleashed from his self-made prison. He had died in the walls, sealed by his own guilt, and now AB's completed spiritual form had released him. You put them together, the father's voice rasped, wet and thick, echoing the suffocating sound from the fireplace. You finished the house, and released the truth. The father's gaunt, moss-coated face followed the hand. His eyes were wide, white, and fixed on the one item Elias still held, the river stone. The stone. You must put it back. Seal the truth. Or she will have it all. Elias looked from the father, half materialized from the fungal blackness of the wall, to the dark hole containing AB's bones. The father was terrified, not of Elias, but of her. Elias understood. The father hadn't sealed AB to trap her essence. He had sealed her remains and her effects to trap his own guilt and prevent his soul from being judged. The river stone was the seal on his own horrific secret. The father lunged, a desperate, clawing movement, trying to reach the stone. Elias had to make a choice, reseal the father's guilt and restore the house to its silent, deadly prison, or allow AB to finally claim the last truth. The sight of Arthur Vance, the father, partially emerging from the fungal blackness of the wall, solidified Elias' resolve. The man was a creature of pure, suffocating malice and guilt, desperate to restore the seal on his horrific crime. "Give me the stone," Arthur hissed, his voice a gravelly echo of the suffocating choking sound Elias had heard earlier. His skeletal fingers twitched, leaving streaks of black, oily slime on the drywall. Elias clutched the river stone tighter, looking at the two terrible forces in the room. AB was the profound despair and loss contained in the small bones below. Arthur was the embodied guilt and frantic denial trapped in the walls. "You built her a coffin," Elias said, his voice firm despite the terror. "You don't get to seal that again." As Elias spoke, the 7 artifacts on the floor began to vibrate, emitting a faint, high-pitched whine. The velvet ribbon, the rocking horse, the locket, the journal, the watch, the doll's head, and the white shoe, they were all humming, channeling the freed essence of A.B. Arthur shrieked, a sound of pure panic. "You don't understand. She's not finished. If you don't seal the stone, she takes everything. She takes the house. She takes you." Elias looked at the hole leading to AB's remains. He saw no manifestation, no vengeful spirit, just the tiny, clean skeleton in the black fluid. But the weight of despair, the 7th echo, was still crushing the air in the room. He realized the key Arthur mentioned on the top was not the fingerbone. The key was the final choice. Elias walked slowly towards the hole containing AB's remains. Arthur lunged further out of the wall, his torso now exposed, the black moss pulsing beneath his stretched, dried skin. "Stop! Don't you dare!" Arthur roared, his voice cracking the remaining silence. Elias ignored him. He stood over the hole, looking down at the little white bones. He took the river stone, the last truth, and spoke directly to the remains. "You were sealed, "A.B. You were broken up and made into a secret. But the friends are all back together. You are whole now." With a sense of terrible finality, Elias dropped the smooth, warm river stone directly into the black, viscous fluid below. The moment the stone hit the fluid, a blinding, white flash erupted from the hole. The light was so intense Elias had to shield his eyes. The 7 artifacts on the floor of the closet rose into the air, spinning rapidly in a tight vortex of wood, metal, and velvet. They were instantly accelerated, turning into a blur of matter that shot straight down, plunging into the fluid-filled hole. A long, sustained scream tore through the air, but it was neither AB's terror nor Arthur's panic. It was a sound of pure, final release, a note held so high and so intensely that the air itself felt like it was tearing. The white light subsided, leaving the closet bathed in a deep, absolute darkness. Elias turned back to the wall where Arthur Vance was struggling. The father was frozen, his mouth open in a soundless, agonized scream. "No! No!" Arthur shrieked, his voice losing its guttural texture, becoming thin and fading. The black, oily fungus that coated the inside of the wall began to rapidly recede, pulling Arthur Vance back into the cavity. His spectral, moss-coated form convulsed, his eyes rolling back into his head as he was forcibly drawn into the drywall. "You were supposed to seal me. Not release her. Not." His voice was cut off entirely as the wall seam zipped shut, the torn drywall smoothing itself out, the convexity collapsing. In an instant, the closet wall was seamless, flat, and solid again. The air was no neutral, but sterile and cold, devoid of any scent or sound. The hole leading to AB's remains was also gone. The cedar box, the safe, the fingerbone lock, everything had been erased. The entire wall was now pristine drywall. Elias stood alone in the center of the closet, shaking, his clothes covered in dust and slime. The house was silent. The father was gone. AB was gone. The game was over. Elias had not restored the prison, he had granted the final peace. He walked out of the closet and downstairs, fully expecting the house to be in ruins. But 148 Hawthorne Lane was perfect. The tiling in the pantry was smooth, the baseboard under the stairs was flawless, the window frame was seamless. The house was no longer a cage or a tomb. It was empty. Elias knew he couldn't stay. He gathered his wallet, keys, and phone. As he walked toward the front door, he passed the entryway wall, the very wall where the thudding had started. He paused and pressed his ear to the wall. Nothing. But just as his hand lifted to open the door and walk out forever, a single, tiny, almost inaudible tap came from inside the wall. Tap. It was the sound of a small, unburdened sigh. The nightmare was over, but the house had a new owner. And Elias knew, with sickening certainty, that he was the only one who could truly attest to the terror sealed within the new foundations of 148 Hawthorne Lane. Elias didn't hesitate. The single, faint, unburdened sigh from the wall was not menacing. It was a final, dismissive closure. He was being allowed to leave. He opened the front door and stepped out into the blinding, ordinary daylight of Whispering Pines subdivision. He didn't look back. He simply kept walking until he reached the edge of the development, the clean, uniform houses fading into a sickening blur. He found a small, busy coffee shop half an hour later and sunk into a booth, his body vibrating with residual adrenaline. He immediately called the local police, reporting a hidden body and sealed-in evidence at 148 Hawthorne Lane, providing Arthur B. Vance's name and the specific location of the former safe in the master closet. He spoke calmly, concisely, and ended the call before the startled dispatcher could ask too many questions. He knew he sounded insane, but the evidence was still there, embedded in the structure. Then, Elias faced his own inventory of absence. The 7 artifacts were gone, sealed with AB and Arthur. But he still had the blueprints and the knowledge they contained. He pulled the rolled-up plans from his satchel and spread them on the sticky coffee shop table. He focused on the master bedroom closet where the final reckoning had occurred. Arthur's detailed, feverish red ink notes were still there, detailing the 7th echo chamber. Elias saw a marginal note he hadn't fully processed before: the final chamber holds the truth. But the foundation is still wet. The house breathes. I need to make a new core. The foundation is still wet. Elias had assumed the house was 4 years old. But the documentation he'd skimmed showed the building permits were pulled and closed 4 months prior. Arthur Vance hadn't built a house 4 years ago. He had built it recently, specifically to bury AB and then himself. He was the previous owner, the one who had fled. The Harrisons, the previous owners, cited by the realtor, were just a hastily inserted red herring to obscure the true history. Arthur was the builder, the original occupant, and the victim perpetrator who had disappeared 4 months ago, leaving the house, new and vacant. Elias traced the blueprint to the foundation. Arthur had marked a deep, subterranean utility space beneath the main floor, accessible only through a sealed hatch in the garage. This space was labeled ominously, the core. What did he mean, make a new core? Elias whispered, his voice hoarse. He knew he shouldn't go back, but the blueprints held a terrible gravitational pull. Arthur's final, desperate note implied that the father knew his seal might be broken, and he'd built a contingency. Elias had granted AB peace by unsealing her suffering and completing her spirit. But in doing so, he might have left a final, structural piece of Arthur's madness in place. He drove back, not to 148 Hawthorne Lane but to a vantage point across the street, watching from his parked car. Within the hour, 2 unmarked police cars and a white van from the medical examiner's office pulled up to the house. Elias watched as uniformed officers breached the front door. The investigation was underway. He watched the front of the house for hours. Finally, he saw 2 figures emerge, both detectives. They were talking animatedly, one rubbing his temples. A few minutes later, the medical examiner's van drove away. The front door remained sealed with police tape. Elias knew they had found ABS remains and the evidence of the father's gruesome self-entombment. The truth was now out. He waited until dusk, until the police activity died down and only 1 patrol car was left guarding the premises. Then, using his architectural knowledge, he snuck around the back, vaulted the low privacy fence, and slipped into the unlocked, side-facing garage. He went straight to the garage floor. The blueprints showed a specific seam in the concrete, hidden beneath a storage cabinet. He moved the cabinet, revealing a perfectly concealed seam. He pried it open with a crowbar he found in the garage. The concrete hatch came up with a grinding scrape, revealing a dark, claustrophobic opening leading down. The air that wafted up was cool, sterile, and slightly oily. Elias took a deep breath, clutching his flashlight and the blueprints. He was going down to the core. He had to know what the father had done to the foundation to ensure the house's perpetual silence. He descended the rusted metal ladder. The space was a crawl space, but Arthur had reinforced it into a tight, low chamber. The flashlight beam danced across the bare concrete foundation walls. He followed the plans to the center of the core. And there, resting on a pedestal carved out of the raw concrete, was the father's final, structural addition. It was not an artifact or a bone. It was a single, perfect cube of polished, translucent black resin, roughly the size of a microwave oven. The resin was not inert. It pulsed with a faint, steady internal luminescence, a tiny, regular flash of white light deep within its center. Elias understood Arthur's final message. I need to make a new core. Arthur Vance had created a permanent, synthetic echo chamber, a solid, structural battery to contain the house's silence and the memory of his act, completely independent of ABS remains. He had created the house's new, evil heart. As Elias stood there, staring at the humming black cube, the final echo that had been contained in the stone and released by ABS piece, the overwhelming feeling of despair, returned. But this time, it was colder, sharper, and utterly manufactured. The black cube began to vibrate, and the white pulse inside quickened its rhythm. Arthur Vance's last, terrible failsafe was activating. The moment the black resin cube began its rapid internal pulse, Elias understood its horrifying purpose. The cube was the father's ultimate failsafe, a condensed, solidified reservoir of the house's trauma. The release of AB had only served to energize and activate this malignant new core. The feeling of artificial, penetrating despair intensified, radiating from the cube like invisible heat. It was a sterile, hopeless feeling that didn't just affect his emotions, but felt like a physical pressure on his brain. Arthur had successfully synthesized the horror. Elias knew he couldn't leave it. If this core remained, 148 Hawthorne Lane would not be merely haunted, it would be a perpetual, radiating epicenter of manufactured dread, infecting the entire subdivision. He needed to destroy it. He scrambled back up the ladder, grabbing a heavy-duty sledgehammer from the garage workbench. He descended again, his eyes fixed on the pulsing black cube. The closer he got, the more intense the despair became. He could hear Arthur Vance's voice, not as an echo, but as a thought implanted in his mind. You can't break the seal. It is perfect. It is forever. Stay here. Let the silence consume you. Elias fought through the mental paralysis, raising the sledgehammer. The cube pulsed faster, and the foundation walls around him began to emit a low, painful drone, the culmination of all 7 echoes, synthesized into a single, agonizing frequency. He swung the sledgehammer with all his remaining strength, aiming for the center of the black resin cube. Crack. The blow connected, but the resin was incredibly dense. It didn't shatter, it only cracked, a single, thin fissure appearing across its top surface. The drone immediately amplified into a deafening shriek. The air in the core space thickened, and the black, oily slime Elias had seen with ABS remains began to seep out of the crack in the cube, smelling strongly of sulfur and burning plastic. The residual force of Arthur Vance, the overwhelming, suffocating sense of guilt and panic, manifested as a blast of wind that ripped through the small space, slamming Elias against the concrete wall. He gasped, dropping the hammer. He looked at the cracked cube. The internal white light was now frantic, strobing like a failing alarm. He saw the hammer lying just a foot away, within reach. He had to hit it again, with absolute force. He lunged for the hammer, ignoring the searing cold that emanated from the resin. He gripped the handle and, fueled by a final burst of rage against the father's persistent evil, swung the sledgehammer a second time, connecting precisely with the existing crack. Krrrack. The cube exploded. It didn't shatter into pieces. It imploded inward with a flash of searing white light and an incredible vacuum of air. The black resin dissolved instantly into nothingness, leaving only a faint smell of ozone and burnt earth. The drone stopped instantly. The manufactured despair vanished. The core space was suddenly quiet, dark, and utterly normal. Elias leaned against the cool, damp concrete, panting. It was over. The house was structurally clean. The physical body of the horror, AB, was gone, and the spiritual energy of the guilt, Arthur, was gone. The father's final, synthesized core was destroyed. He climbed back out of the core, resealed the hatch, and replaced the cabinet. He left the garage, slipped over the fence, and disappeared into the night. He never returned to 148 Hawthorne Lane. Epilogue. Months later, Elias, living anonymously 2 states away, saw a brief article online. The police investigation at 148 Hawthorne Lane had concluded. The remains of a child, A.B. Vance, were confirmed, along with evidence of a forced suicide of the perpetrator, the builder Arthur Vance. The case was closed. Elias read the final paragraph. A quote from the current listing agent. The house has been completely remediated and structurally certified. It's a beautiful, modern home in a quiet area. There is absolutely no remaining trace of the unfortunate incident. It's a fresh start for a new family. Elias closed his laptop, nodding. The agent was technically right. The house was clean. The father's guilt and the daughter's sorrow were gone. But Elias knew the final, ultimate truth of 148 Hawthorne Lane. He walked to his own living room window. He pressed his ear to the wall, a habit he couldn't break. The wall was silent. He paused, then smiled faintly. He could no longer hear the echoes of pain, but sometimes, on the quietest nights, he heard something else from the house, the faint, occasional, unburdened sigh that spoke of a final, enduring peace. A.B. Vance may have been murdered, but she had become the true, quiet spirit of the house. And she was finally, utterly, and perfectly home.